Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom in the past between primary and secondary worlds. I'm your host, Snyder, and I am always grateful for your company. So, obviously, we're doing things a little bit differently here. I guess I should say, obviously, if you're watching the video on this, because I've been posting our interviews to YouTube for a little while now. This is the first time I'm recording a video intro. And so, if you are listening to this on the Mythic Mind podcast, then know that you can watch the full video as well. And I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. And so, go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you're watching this on YouTube, then know that you can also listen to this as a podcast. And so, if that's of interest to you, then make sure that you also subscribe to the Mythic Mind Legacy podcast on any podcast app of your choice. Well, today I come to you from the plains of Rohan, as you can see if you're watching the video, so that we can discuss the War of the Rohirrim, the recent Lord of the Rings anime that takes place within the Jacksonverse, looking at the story of Helm Hammerhand and some of the story that surrounds his life as we get in the short appendix at the end of Lord of the Rings. Now, I was fairly skeptical going into this movie. I was not really expecting it to be great. In fact, I was actually expecting it to be pretty bad. But I like to know what's going on in the world of Tolkien media. And so I wanted to experience it. And I'm someone who wants these things to succeed. Even though I may have some criticisms, I go into these wanting to enjoy them. And fortunately, that's what I did. I enjoyed this movie. It wasn't the ideological slot fest that I kind of thought it might be. No, I actually thought that it was quite good. And I'll get into some of the reasons for that in the conversation that ensues as I bring in a couple other guys to talk about our first impressions about this film. Now, I do want to emphasize that these are first impressions. All of us have only seen this movie one time. It had just come out just a few days before we recorded this. And so some of our thoughts may change over time. But overall, like I said, I enjoyed the movie and I thought this was a good conversation. So let's go ahead and bring that in. All right, welcome to Mythic Mind, where we're going to discuss the new Lord of the Rings movie, The War of the Rohirrim. Definitely some mixed thoughts, even in this conversation we're about to have here. As I'm joined by Thomas Salerno, who many of you have heard from many times up to this point, as well as Master Samwise, who runs. Well, he can tell us a little bit about the kind of stuff he's into, but he runs what seems to be a pretty high engagement YouTube channel covering Tolkien stories, adjacent, no insult intended nerd material. Um, and so let's just start with brief introductions here. Sam, can you tell us just a little bit more about what it is that you do and kind of what you bring to the table?
Yeah. So first off, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk about this, especially because have somewhat of a different opinion on War of the Heroes. So I expect a good conversation. But yeah, I run the Master Samwise channel, which the tagline for that channel is essays on the stories that really matter, right? Obviously borrowing that phrase from Tolkien. Um, I think Sam says that in the book. Um, does say it at some point. Sometimes my memory of the books and the movies do get conflated. But anyhow, so the longer thesis being that stories change us in ways that we may not even realize. And so the goal of the channel is to elucidate the truths that these stories speak and how they can and should affect us in, ways that we may not have even noticed, right? So that's taking even stories in pagan worlds like the God of War video games and how like the characters do in fact portray, universal as Christian motifs, and through their growth that they go through, their themes are very much pointing towards God. Even if I don't usually explicitly state that in the channel, right? It's not I don't know, agnostic by any means, but it's just not something I make a habit of shouting from the rooftops and kind of let it just seep in, basically. So, yeah, that's the basis of that.
Oh, and side note, I love the Rohan flag in your background.
Yeah,
That's
I
an
was
impressive piece there.
purchased that. It was a while ago. But yeah, one of my favorites.
Cool, cool. Now, Thomas, you're probably tired of introducing yourself onto my show, but things like this tend to bring in some new people, and so tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Yeah, so I'm an author, writer, podcaster. I wear a lot of hats. Um, people who watch this show might be interested to know that I do a lot of my podcasting for the StarQuest Production Network, or SQPN. You can find us on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts. I'm the regular host, and sometimes, sometimes I don't host, sometimes I'm the panelist, but I'm a regular host on the Secrets of Middle-earth podcast that we do. We have episodes that come out pretty much twice a month now for that show. And, we cover everything related to Tolkien, from the books to the movies to, the Rings of Power to this film. We just recorded our review for this film. So I'm excited to talk about it again because, I, I, I talk about Tolkien to anyone who will listen. So
Right, as do probably many of us and those of us who are listening right now. Um, so I think this will be an interesting conversation because Thomas and I both seem to be at least mostly favorable toward this movie. I know Sam is not, although, and I'm sure that if this conversation spills into broader territory at all, we probably have some differences when it comes to Rings of Power as well. I think that Thomas is probably more favorable, though maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Um, but we
I
can,
enjoy it
yeah.
for what it is. I don't think it's the greatest show ever or anything like that. I enjoyed it. And, I think if you listen to our reviews of the show, we were broadly favorable, though we definitely, had our problems with it and went on at length about that. But yeah, no, I enjoy it as one of the most expensive bits of fan fiction ever made.
I could actually mostly sympathize with that. It's expensive fan fiction.
Yeah.
But oh well, I guess we already broached the subject. Sam, what do you think of Rings of Power, real quickly?
So I watched the first season in its entirety, back around when it came out, and then I watched the first three episodes of the second season and never bothered watching anything more than that. Um, I certainly don't hate it as much as I've seen people hate it. I don't think it's particularly well written. I think the characters suffer from a lot of inconsistencies, and that affects Galadriel, everyone from Galadriel to Gil-galad to Durin, especially Durin the Third. And it was really boring. My wife and I watched the first two episodes of the second season together, and it was just like I was falling asleep. We were both falling asleep. And she had no interest in watching the third episode. And I'm a fairly harsh critic of stuff, especially for stuff that's connected to a world that I love, that I grew up with, that I have very, very strong attachment to. Um, my wife is a less harsh critic. So when she has no interest in watching something, no one, continuing to watch something, that's kind of it's a good bar for me to set. Like, okay, this is not just me being irrationally critical.
That's fair. And yeah, I really want to enjoy Tolkien media. Like, I don't want to
I
be
would love
super
to.
critical. I hate
Yeah.
this. I don't want to be that guy. And so I've kind of talked myself into tolerating Rings of Power as kind of expensive, superficial fan fiction.
Yeah.
It's shallow, but at the same time, I mean, even in our current culture, as far as like mainstream fantasy goes, even an echo of Tolkien, it has at least some merits to it,
I
even
think,
if
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not what it could be.
Absolutely. If there are things you can glean from Rings of Power, and there's more you can glean from more of the Rohirrim
Yeah.
that speak to the truths that Tolkien talks about, that have, even just little bits of his philosophy and his worldview that are dropped in there, then that's great, right? If you get that out of there, that's fantastic.
Right. And that's basically the point of the podcast I do, Secrets of Middle Earth, where it's like if we can find anything, that brings us back to Tolkien, we'll go on and on about it. So yeah.
Right. I mean, as long as they're not being clearly
Anti-Tolkien.
like
Yeah.
intentionally subversive,
Mhm.
in like major philosophical ways. Like I'm actually I don't want them to tinker with the plot, the lore more than they have to adapt it to a story. I don't want that. I can tolerate that. The only times when I go like hardcore critic is when I feel like they're philosophical subversions. And I mean there's some of that, but I don't feel like it's nearly as bad as it could be. And maybe I'm showing them too much grace. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, everything exists on a sliding scale. Peter Jackson
Yeah.
changed the characters in
Yeah.
significant ways in some points and certain plot points. I mean, I have a whole video on why the Army of the Dead is BS. And, I named it as such because it is. It severely cheapened the victory of men, for one thing, and,
Yeah.
didn't make sense within the lore. Anyhow. But yeah, so like but there's a whole sliding scale of it, right? I think Peter Jackson did a much, much better job. I would never, I don't know, equate the two. Peter Jackson's movies far outstrip anything that's come since. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, to be specific. He did make 3 other movies.
We don't talk about that. Yeah.
That's a running gag on our show on the Secrets of Middle Earth, that we always like we bring up the Hobbit movies and then we're like, there's our contractually obligated reference to the Hobbit trilogy. It's like we haven't reviewed them yet, and we're kind of teasing fans because we keep bringing it up and then we end up not reviewing it, but we'll get to them eventually.
There is no Hobbit movie in Bossing, say.
See, I actually have not even watched all of them through. I've earlier this year, I finally decided, all right, I'm going to give it a shot. And maybe I shouldn't have started with the extended edition. I don't know, but
oh no, those are even
there's an
worse.
Extended edition of them. I didn't know there was an extended. I've only seen the first 2, to be clear. I'd never bothered watching the Battle of 5 Armies, but I didn't realize there was an extended edition of these.
And see, I'm kind of a completionist. Like I felt like that's what I needed to do. I made it about to Goblin Town.
The extended edition of Unexpected Journey is so poorly edited. Like they just jam those deleted scenes in there, and they actually break continuity with the rest of the movie. Not like the extended editions of the original Lord of the Rings films.
Also known as the correct versions of Lord of the Rings.
Correct version, yeah. The extended editions are bust. Yeah, it's like, but with The Hobbit, at least I can only speak to that first one, but in terms of the extended edition, but it's so badly edited. Wow. Okay, yeah.
I said I made it to Goblin Town, got distracted, just never made it back.
Oh yeah, that's where some of the worst editing snafus are, in Goblin Town. Yeah. Oh.
But okay, we're starting to hit like every Tolkien media here, but War of the Rohirrim. Yeah. So let's bring it back to focus. Now, before we get into our thoughts of what we walked out with, and I should say that this movie just came out. I don't know about you guys. I've only seen it one time, which it makes reviews a little bit difficult because I know some things kind of need to grow on you. You kind of need to see it more than once. So these are all just first impressions coming out here. But before you even went into the movie, I'd be interested in knowing what you were expecting, just based off any promotional material you've seen, trailers, whatever. Like, what were your thoughts? Were you optimistic? Were you just kind of hopeful? Were you pessimistic? Like, what were you expecting going in? Sam, what were you thinking about going into it?
I was highly skeptical. I think I said this in my review, but I'm just highly skeptical going into everything nowadays, especially for stuff that is in a world that I love because I've been hurt so many times. One of my favorite shows that's come out in recent years was Andor. I've been a Star Wars fan as long as I can remember, and I didn't watch Andor for at least until several months after it was all completely done with its 12-episode run, because I went, I liked Rogue One. I liked it a lot, actually, but it's like, yeah, he was a fine character, I guess. I'm not really that interested. And then I just kept hearing good things. Like, oh, I guess I'll check this out. But I've been burned too many times. The Obi-Wan Kenobi show, the Boba Fett show, Rings of Power, and who knows what else. And so I was very, very skeptical going in for sure. And it honestly was probably better than I expected it to be.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, I'm going to be careful not to derail us on Star Wars now. But I can definitely sympathize with that. I mean, I watched a couple seasons of Mandalorian, Boba Fett, but after that,
I forgot
got
about
to a point where
season 3 of Mandalorian is very bad.
I never saw it. I mean, I got to a point where, and I can't even believe I say this, 10 years ago, I wouldn't believe it. I don't really care about Star Wars anymore. I just feel like it's sort of fizzled out for me for so many reasons. But again, It's not a Star Wars podcast. Okay, so all right, fair enough. You're very skeptical for I think some good reasons. Thomas, what were you thinking of going into this?
I was broadly optimistic going into this. I had my concerns, but I liked the trailers that I had seen. The director of this film also directed The Ninth Jedi, which was one of my favorite of the Star Wars anime shorts that they released. So, bringing it back to Star Wars again. But yeah, and I was like, well, I really, really like The Ninth Jedi. I think he'll probably do a good job in the Lord of the Rings universe. So yeah, I did have my concerns in terms of lore and stuff and how they were going to handle some of the characters, but when coming out of the movie, I was broadly pleased with what they did. Um, yeah, so I found my optimism rewarded a little when I came out. Yeah, I thought definitely it was superior, obviously superior to the Rings of Power in terms of
Yes.
the lore area. I basically I think the first thing I said when I came out was that it was respectful to the lore, the way a Jackson verse movie should be, unlike some of unlike the Hobbit movies. But anyway, yeah. So yeah, I was broadly optimistic going in and felt good coming out. So I definitely think it's worth seeing if you're a Tolkien fan.
Yeah, when I first heard the concept, I was very interested. I mean, I love Rohan. I love the Anglo-Saxon vibes. That the area of the lore is definitely appealing to me, and the fact that they're dealing with an appendix and part of appendix that's relatively short means that they have some good free range to tell a story without breaking the lore. If they did it right, and I feel like they largely accomplished that as far as I'm concerned. But once the trailer started getting released and some of the other promotional material, I was very, very skeptical about what we were walking into. I kind of
Mm.
expected it was going to be another Galadriel girl boss situation where you have your one female protagonist who in the as Tolkien gives us, doesn't even have a name, right? She's such a minor
Right.
character, and now she's going to be the main character who's just going to, defeat all the bad guys, save the day, and do everything all by herself. I was kind of expecting that sort of vibe. No, I'm very, I was. That's not what I saw when I saw the movie. I was very
Right.
pleasantly
Yeah.
surprised. Not to mention the fact that also I kind of have not necessarily prejudice, but as far as like interest level goes, sort of prejudice against anime, and that's just not my thing. Like it's not something I've ever really been interested in. The last time I watched an anime show, there were only 150 Pokemon. So that
Yeah.
kind of goes back to when I last watched anime, and so just
Hmm.
it's not a domain that I'm just really used to, naturally drawn to. But and so on that level, as far as the art of the animation, I'm not a very good critic because I don't really know that scene very well, and so just kind of walking into it somewhat as an outsider. I mean, I thought it was done pretty well. I felt like it was good animation. Artistry. They didn't disrupt the plot fundamentally, and I felt like the changes they did make were reasonable for storytelling. And so overall, I was very pleasantly surprised. And so I'm not going to say this is the best written thing or the best Tolkien thing ever. I think
Right.
that
Yeah.
the Jackson Lord of the Rings. I mean, I think it's better. But at the same time, I enjoyed it, and it's something that I want to see again. And so overall, I was pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, what you said earlier about it's hard for me to review stuff after seeing it one time, right? I formed my initial opinion of it. I made my review based off of that. I said to my wife, I'm going to review it based on how I feel now. I might watch it again and feel differently. Like that's the tough thing. I don't generally review movies that have just come out. I review
Hmm.
stuff that has been out for a long time and do character analyses of characters who I'm very well familiar with that I watched two or three times before even making a video because I don't like going in, making something that I'm not quite sure of, right? It's like this is not, this is kind of it's very much a snapshot of my opinion at the time. It's something I'm like I would like to see this again. Rings of Power, I have no interest in ever seeing again. I have But like Rohirrim, yeah, absolutely. And if you said this is your favorite Tolkien, adaptation since 2003, I honestly I might even agree.
Yeah. I And I think that says something. Just the fact that it's something that, that right now, at least first impressions, you're pretty critical of the movie, but something that you want to see again. That says something about it. And I totally agree with Rings of Power. Now, I've seen every episode that comes out. I'll keep watching just because I like to know what people are doing in the Tolkien media universe. But it's not something I'm ever going to rewatch, unlike, the Lord of the Rings movies, which I watch on a very regular basis. Um, so what would you say, Sam, since you're the most critical of this? I mean, what are your major criticisms of what they did wrong or what you just didn't like?
So one of the biggest things that really soured me on the movie was that they very clearly were going for the vibe of, hey, you remember Jackson's Lord of the Rings? That was, I mean, it was straight in the beginning of the trailer,
Mhm.
right? Remember Peter Jackson, and then you had, I think is it South Park that has like the member berries. That's their bit. I don't know. I don't generally watch
Right.
South Park, but like that's it's like, yeah, remember this, remember that. You had the Mama Kill, you had the Watcher in the water, which I'm sure that breaks some lore being in Rohan, but whatever. I don't really care about that. It was just, but it was one of the things. And then you had the whole the battle outside of Edoras was very much their charge. There was very much like we're trying to make this as much like the charge at the Pelennor Fields as we can. Um, and there are a couple of other ones. Oh, you had in similar vein, you had Freyalof showing up at Helm's Deep and leading the charge down the slope like Gandalf and Éomer do in the
Hmm.
movie. I'm sure there were a couple things I'm missing, but you had the orcs pulling rings off dead bodies as if that was
Aha.
going to find the one ring. That bit
Very
just
silly.
there Gandalf showing up at the end and or being mentioned at the end. Saruman shows up at the end, but yeah. And so like it felt like that was the vibe they were going for was, hey, you remember this? You remember this? You remember this? Like, yeah, I remember. Don't remind me. I'd rather be watching. Don't remind me that, but I'd rather be watching that movie. Um, and then my other main criticism is I care a lot about characters and character arcs, and I think Hera's had a decent one if they'd ended it differently because they kind of just they she did go through a struggle. She went through even some despair, and she came out hopeful. There are two moments that I think I would have done differently. And there's one where Wolf asks her, like during their duels, like, who are you pledged to? I believe something like that, and she says death, if
Death.
I'm remembering
Yeah.
correctly.
Hmm.
And she should have said my people or my family, in my opinion, because that makes her I feel like her arc should have been one of growth to duty towards her people. Like the narrator, Miranda Otto, starts out by telling us that she is, wild, headstrong, and free, something to that effect. And then she ends the movie by telling us that she is wild, headstrong, and free. And I would have reshaped that arc to be one of growth into, leadership and responsibility, which is what she takes on. But
Hmm.
then at the end, she just kind of doesn't because they had to stick to the lore. They felt that they had to stick to the lore where Freyalof actually becomes the first
The
king of the
king. Yeah.
second line.
Hmm.
And Hera just goes off. She's still loyal. She just tells him, like you have my sword if you need it. But I felt like they could have handled her arc better. Helm, I feel was changed from the book in just in small ways, but ways that I think matter. Where he starts a more honorable brawl with Freka and lets Freka get the first punch in. If you read again, it's a couple lines, but it really sounds like Helm sucker punches him. Um, and then yeah, so there just wasn't, and then there wasn't enough Helm. They made Helm a little too honorable, in my opinion. Like Helm is a consummate warrior and leader, but he's not the the sense that I get from the paragraph in the appendix is that he's not the most honorable,
Hmm.
and that his ambition and his pride did lead a little bit to his downfall, which you get that sense somewhat in the movie, but could have been explored more. And then I'm talking a lot, so I'll finish with this thought. Her Hera's brothers, they had some good, like, kind of heroic moments. I felt we didn't spend enough time with them. I didn't get to know them very well, and I would have liked to. So that's my main criticisms.
And here's the interesting thing, Sam. I don't disagree with anything you just said. It's just that
Ah,
for me, all of that, the movie still landed on the broadly positive side. But yeah, I pretty much agree with all of those criticisms. Like if I was looking for ways I could improve the movie, I would pretty much take what you said as a starting point. Yeah, I think those are reasonable criticisms.
So Thomas, what do you think they did right, or like that, that outweighs those criticisms that you share?
Um, I actually did though. I think one thing I thought they did a good job of showing Helm as kind of a morally ambiguous character, although I feel like they could have done leaned into that more. I mean, he banishes his nephew seemingly for no good reason. He puts, too much trust in that one guy. Oh, I would have made that less obvious, by the way, if I was going to critique something. Who would have thought a guy called Lord Thorn would be the traitor? Like I would have made that a little bit less on the nose, but in any case. So what made it work for me was um yeah, I really like seeing characters grow and change throughout the movie. And I just thought that in terms of a lot of the female main protagonists that we have seen recently, I thought Hera was by far the strongest. Like, in terms of her character arc was pretty solid. She actually does grow and change and suffer adversity and isn't just immediately good at everything. I just was on board with the characters.
Right. She can't single-handedly take on the military of Numenor in a sword fight.
Right, yeah. And I was just on board with what the characters were doing. I thought that a lot of the heroic moments landed for me. And when I was catching little changes from those few paragraphs that we had in the appendices, I was like, okay, for the story they're telling, that makes sense. But I also appreciated that they did lift entire lines of dialogue from the Rohan section of Tolkien's appendices, and I just felt that oh um they didn't downplay any of the men to lift Hera up, if
They
that
didn't.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a lot of contemporary media, they feel they need to make the men stupid or peevish or corrupt or incompetent or any of these other things in order to lift up the female character, which does a disservice to both, not just the men. But it's like they did not do that here. And I just felt that, and Helm was suitably heroic, and so were the brothers. I like the brothers a lot. I agree. I would have liked more time to develop them. Um, but I get that we're not doing a full 3 hours here like Jackson would have done. But yeah, I and my biggest lore. I'll tell you what my biggest concern going in was that they were going to write Freyalaf out of the movie completely, and they did not do that. And I remember when we came out, my brother said to me, he's like, if anyone else had made this movie, they would have just written Freyalaf out, because he's it's like because without him, you could have put Hera in his place. The biggest lore change I thought they made was giving Hera the final kill of Wolf rather than Freyalaf. In the book, it's Freyalaf. But I expected that once I knew Freyalaf was in the movie. I was like, okay, they're going to give Hera the kill because of what they're built, the personal animosity between them. So I thought that made sense for this adaptation, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch. But yeah, I know I'm kind of rambling. I've had a really long week, by the way. So if I begin to ramble, it's just because I'm tired. We've had a busy week at work, but yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I will say that I am glad that they didn't make Hera the queen of Rohan at the end. That would just
Right, yeah.
That would have called me to just write it off altogether. Because and like you said, she's not a just like smash the patriarchy, everything's about me, liberation. Like no, she very much serves the honor of her king and father. She is concerned about the good of her people. She is not this rebel without a cause, there's a tempest in me kind of figure. Um, and so, I like that. She's part of the society that she kind of represents as the heroine of the story. And so that made me overall pretty comfortable with what they did with her. Now, yes, she doesn't really have much of an arc in that she doesn't change in any dramatic form throughout the movie. She basically is who she is at the beginning, at the end. But at the same time, like I know it's kind of a faux pas that people will call her, a plain Jane or whatever they say, when she doesn't really have any development. But at the same time, I mean, the Rohirrim, that these people are very much drawn from the northern spirit, the Anglo-Saxons. And as somebody who likes to read the Norse tales, the Volsungs, the Eddas, those characters for the most part don't really have arcs. Like they don't really change. These are just
Right.
people who are put by fate in a certain situation and they play the role that is allotted to them. And so the story isn't so much about their development as characters. The story is about the things that are happening in the broader sphere, but focusing in on the role that specific characters have to play within that broader story. And so it's like the story is the story, the character is not the story. And so I'm actually okay with a character not having an arc per se, so long as there is some kind of compelling story taking place around them. I feel like that actually captures the traditions of the Northern Spirit pretty well. Now, perhaps it could be, in fact, no, I mean, I think that even in Tolkien's own writing, like you have some characters that are like that are strong
Oh,
characters
absolutely.
that don't, I mean, like, Book Aragorn is not fundamentally different by the end than he is at the beginning. Um,
Oh.
In the
you
book,
know,
yeah.
yeah, Jackson Aragorn, sure, that's that's one of the things I think Jackson did wrong. But Book Aragorn is basically the same throughout the story, and so I'm actually okay with the fact that Hera doesn't have an arc.
Yeah, so there's not having an arc, which you can do. I think what bugged me was that the narrator told us about her. I hate it when narrators tell me
Oh,
about
That's fair.
characters.
That's fair. Yeah.
If they hadn't included those lines, I'd probably be much more favorable. But that really bugs me. And yeah, so I think they walked the line with her being too talented versus not too talented. You have great moments like she doesn't take out that troll that was there on the hit cliffs around Helm's Deep for whatever reason. Helm has to do that. Great. But she does also just like very quickly organize an evacuation from Edoras. Okay, great. She's been in the royal family. She's able to do that. She is able to do these things. I think they walk that line pretty well with her being very competent and capable. And also having her moments where she didn't feel like she was. Um, and then, yeah, otherwise, the character it didn't resonate with me a ton. She was good enough for the story, I suppose. Um, but there was the one moment that felt not as well earned as I think the story thought it was, and I do remember this is one of the ones where I validated this with my wife. I was like, "Am I being critical?" She's like, "I thought the same thing." Was when they're at the gate of the Hornburg, and Helm pushes her back inside, and he's like, "I should have listened to you. I should have trusted you." And I went, you didn't listen to her one time, and that was kind of it. She just happened to be right. Like, yeah, sure, she was right, but this wasn't like an ongoing thing, or she didn't have any particular reason. It didn't seem like he was being all that brash in his decision making. And that was kind of the larger problem that I didn't really bring up that I had, which it seemed that this story was so focused on Hera, right? You say the story is the story and the characters. I felt that the story really was about her. And when a story is so focused on a character, I want the character to have more of an arc, more of a struggle. Frodo doesn't have so much an arc as he does like experience this continuous pressure and on his will, right? Where he's continually having to fight back this. He's incredibly noble throughout the whole Lord of the Rings. He changes dramatically, obviously, but isn't really so much become a better person. I wanted to see more of that effect on Hera. I think I said this in review. She goes through some incredibly traumatic stuff, and comes out the side more or less unchanged. And for a story that, in my opinion, the story was very focused on her. Like Helm's death, for example, in the appendix, it just takes place as he's out raiding the encamped Dunlanders, right?
Mhm.
Dunlandians, whatever. It just, he goes out, he's doing that repeatedly, and eventually one night he goes out for too long and he freezes to death on his feet, ready to fight. In the movie, they have him do it while he's defending Héra, right? So that's just kind of an example. Like everything she was kind of like a little gravitational center that sucked in all the relevant like story bits, or everything kind of revolved around her. And so I think if you do that, you need a little more character work. I think they did do some character work, a lot better character work than I've seen in the likes of Galadriel or name any Star Wars show that's not Andor in the last decade. But like I said, I'm a fairly harsh critic, especially of things that are near and dear to my heart.
I think that's fair, especially drawing on the Frodo comparison because, I referenced Aragorn, but Frodo's obviously the central figure of the story. And while he doesn't necessarily undergo a radical character transformation, he does have a deepening of his character.
Mm.
As he bears the burden, he incorporates grief and sorrow into his character in a new way. Even as Gandalf, his master, so to speak, we told that he in the Silmarillion that he learned sorrow from Nienna, and that is what brought him wisdom. Frodo shares in that kind of arc himself, and so he has a deepening of character throughout the story. Whereas, I mean, fair enough, Hera really, I mean, she's more or less the same. So I think that's a fair comparison. Now, regarding the character of Helm, that's come up a few times. Um, Thomas, what do you think about the character of Helm? Because I don't know if you've directly addressed that.
Yeah, I thought Helm was handled well. I thought he was more complex than I thought he was going to be, because we see where, his pride sometimes leads him to make rash decisions or, he literally at one point doesn't know his own strength. He's like, "Oh, there's no way I killed that guy." And it's like, "I don't know, man. Did you?" But anyway, yeah, I felt that though the movie shows him as an honorable, kingly man despite character flaws, and I felt that was very interesting. I felt as maybe not to audiences who aren't as familiar with the appendices, maybe his over the top heroic death might not seem earned. But for someone who knew that it was coming, like that, the over the topness of it actually worked very well for me personally. But yeah, that's one criticism I do want to lodge at the movie is that I don't know how audiences who aren't extremely familiar with this stuff are going to take this.
I I
Yeah.
definitely think I think you made a very good point, and I think this is one thing that like yeah, I might watch the movie, come up with a different opinion of Helm, especially in this
Hmm.
movie. I think yeah, I did say I think he was too honorable, and I think you made some good points where they did show more complexity than I think I took away from the film. Um, but I would absolutely agree that I think they needed to earn that death of his more. I think they needed
Hmm.
to spend more time establishing the legend of Helm Hammerhand. It's
Yes. Yeah.
essentially one, maybe two relatively short scenes. That's kind of all you get. And like this is the man. They changed the name of this fortress, right? They're all right for this man, right? This fortress has, as Theoden says, like saved their people numerous times in the past, right? There's a reason for that. And I think they needed to spend more time with Helm and um, I mean, the people within the Hornburg think he's dead,
Yeah.
right? And then he shows up, and then he's dead 5 minutes later. And yeah, it just they did an okay job, I think, kind of portraying the effect um on the Dunlanders. But I think they should have spent a decent bit of the movie, honestly, establishing his legend.
And I do want to mention the character of Wolf as a villain. I felt that he was suitably over the top. I feel, and they said in interviews that I had read before going into this that they were gonna make him an unredeemed villain. and I'm like, okay. And I felt that worked for this story. And I felt he was that villain that I really grew to like hate passionately throughout the movie, especially because like I became so invested in his feud with his General Targ, because I kept saying to myself, and sometimes out loud, I had to stop myself from saying it out loud to Targ, just slit this guy's throat already, because
He never listens to you.
he never listens to you. He clearly doesn't care about the Dunlendings at all. And they say that Targ is a full-blooded Dunlending, whereas as Wolf is at most only half. And he clearly doesn't care about his people on that side of the family, and because he's using them as cannon fodder. Like as soon as he tricks them into thinking that there's gold in the fortress when he knows there's not, I'm like, Targ, do in this guy already. It's like, because I'm like, it reminded me almost of like a World War II movie where you have the reasonably competent general having to listen to this maniac, like this almost Hitlerian maniac making these awful decisions because of his monomaniacal focus on on revenge or whatever. And I'm just like, but I like it was silly, it was goofy at times, but for me that worked. And I was just like, I very much, it worked in the sense that it made me love to hate Wolf.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, I will say that it is kind of refreshing to have a villain that they don't really want you to feel sorry for.
Right.
That he's just a bad guy. Like I think we need some more of that in stories, where it's not gray, it's not ambiguous. They don't want you to sympathize with him. They don't want you to like secretly root for him. Like I mean, obviously connected to Rings of Power, right? Like they want you to kind of root for Sauron at certain times. And I think it's bad, right? That's one of the philosophical qualms that I have with Rings of Power, is that they at times they actively try to want you to like want Sauron and Galadriel to get together, which is just absurd.
Right.
But their whole communities that are like want that to happen, and the fact that would get any kind of bait is just that's problematic. So it's nice to have a villain who's just bad, and they don't really want you to like him.
Right.
That is refreshing. And I will say, one more thing on Helm. I agree with what Sam said, that he is made to be a little bit more honorable than he probably should be. In that first fight, in the appendix, when he punches him and kills him, he doesn't have remorse. Like, oh, what did I do? It just
Right.
happens, and the story moves on. Like, yeah, he probably had it coming.
Does he
Right.
does he in the appendix banish Wolf? That I believe he does.
Yes.
He does.
He does. Yeah.
Yes. So that part is accurate. But I
That's
will say
accurate,
that I did actually really like the way they portrayed him terrorizing his people outside of the Hornburg.
When it was done really well. I just wanted more of it and more how it
More.
affected
Yeah.
like the people of Rohan too.
Right. But I feel like they did a good job of making him seem like some kind of like preternatural being, like
Oh, yeah.
haunting them. Like I feel
Oh,
like
that was good.
that
The
speaks well.
Wraith. Yeah, that was great.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
the like the way that was done, just artistically, the shot of kind of like his wraith like form in the snow was really really good.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I would say definitely better portrayal than in this is really nitpicky, but in Jackson's Two Towers, when they show a statue of Helm Hammerhand, he's literally holding a hammer in his hand. So they definitely got that a little bit better.
Right. He does have a warhammer in this film
Fair enough.
when he's
Fair
riding.
enough.
Yeah.
But I mean, clearly that's not what he's known for, right? It's
Right,
not why he's
yeah.
called Hammerhand. He's called Hammerhand because his hand is a hammer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Um,
I will say along the lines of Wolf, I found him very basic. I think that's what I called him. Every line of dialogue, I think I predicted before he said it, except for the one time when he had Héra held captive and was proposing marriage to her, and basically he'd say he'd stop, and then she says, "Okay, so if I marry you," and he cuts her off and goes, "If," and like, how dare you say if? It's like, bro, did you think she was going to be enthusiastic about marrying you?
Yeah.
You're literally holding her like captive. That
I
was
mean,
one of the lines
it
where I
was a
felt,
pretty extravagant proposal.
But other than that, I whispered to my wife right near the end, Thomas, like we were talking about I was like, why does he keep this general guy around? He never listens to him. Everything the general says, he does the opposite.
He does the opposite. Yeah, I was like,
every single time.
I felt so bad for that guy.
So I was cracking up. The other part that had me cracking up in that scene was they dropped this massive, siege bridge onto the tower, and
no sense.
Héra goes and fights to delay. Okay, fine. Then I went, why aren't they burning this? Why aren't the Rohirrim just shooting this with flaming arrows? Maybe they ran out of fire or something. I don't know. Then after Héra does her whole dramatic scene, then they start burning it. Also, that was just the plan the whole time. So that was one of those things that it's one of those things that if I take the movie seriously, which perhaps I take it too seriously, I roll my eyes and groan, which I did. But also it's funny, and
yeah. I don't think they told I don't think Wolf told the drummer guy on top of that thing what it was going to do. Because
he just goes flying off at the end.
Yeah, he looked really surprised and terrified that it starts like falling towards the wall.
That's
and he's
right.
like, ah! I'm like,
yeah, not sure what he expected was going to happen there.
No, yeah.
That's funny.
I just felt that whole contraption was so silly. I was like, wait, it's not a normal siege tower? What? It extends like some kind of...
I was wondering what they were going to do with that. I was like, there's no wheels. How are they going to lift the whole thing? Oh, yeah. They're just tipping over a giant wooden bridge and hoping it doesn't snap in half when it hits the top of the wall.
Yeah, right. I felt that was very silly, but I was like, you know what? Whatever.
So one thing that Sam brought up was the fact that they, from the very beginning, they're intentionally echoing the Jackson movies.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I mean, did you find that off-putting at all, Thomas, or did you like that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I expected it, so I was just like, okay, and this takes place in the same universe. I felt the Hobbit movies did that a lot worse with some of their groan-inducing callbacks, but or call forwards because they're prequels. Whatever.
So yeah, as is this.
Wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. Yeah.
Yeah, but I expected them to call back to the Jackson movies a lot, so I guess it just kind of rolled off me. I was just when it started to strain credulity for me was the Gandalf thing at the end. I'm like, I get why Saruman's here, because he literally does take control of Isengard after these events. And I thought
he's been mentioned in the appendix. At the very
it's when Freylof, like at Freylof's crowning, I believe.
Crowning, yeah. And it was cool that they got an alternate take from Christopher Lee from the live action movies to give him a line of dialogue. Although I wasn't expecting it to be just one line of dialogue. And when he speaks, I look over at my brother, and my brother's like, "That's all you get." Which made me laugh. But
it was a little lame that they used him in a lot of the promotional material.
Yes, that's it. Yeah. But it strained credulity for me that she gets a letter from Gandalf. Like, wait, how did he? Never mind. Like in my head, I was trying to figure out ways. Like I'm like, okay, he can talk to the eagles. Did the eagle tell him all about Héra or something? Or I was just like, but at that point, it was the end of the movie, so I was just like, okay, that this really doesn't make any sense. But whatever.
They're setting up the sequel.
Yeah.
The part about that was like it's just something about Gandalf taking interest in rings, which I don't think he would have been at that point.
Right.
In his life, his timeline. Which was
that was kind of random.
Maybe.
Yeah, and that was kind of random when they threw the orcs in there.
Yes,
that was
like
that also.
Why are they there, and why are they suddenly digging for rings? Like,
I thought they were funny, but it's like
I didn't understand
it didn't make sense.
They were pulling rings off dead bodies. Like Mordor wants rings. We're collecting rings, as if someone had been wearing the one ring and just they weren't aware of it. I guess it's early enough. Sauron hadn't really. This is what? How long before?
I think he was starting to kind of manifest in Dol Guldur.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But it just like we're just going to collect every ring we can. Hopefully, one of them's the One Ring.
Yeah.
How many rings can there be in Middle Earth?
Right, because at that point, I think Sauron didn't even know that the ring had been found. I'm not sure
Or that it
about the exact
survived, or
timeline.
what? Yeah.
Right. But
Does he know
as
that
a little,
until Gollum? Until getting out of Gollum? I don't know. I
yeah,
forget when Sauron actually finds out that the One Ring had survived.
yeah, I don't remember the
Hmm.
exact timeline. But one kind of Easter egg is drawing a blank on their real names, but the orcs, the voices are Merry and Pippin from the Jackson movies.
Oh, they
Are
really?
It's
they
like a little Easter egg.
really?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's funny.
That's funny. The banter of the orcs did remind me of Shagrat and Gorbag from the books. Where they're
Hey,
just like
fair. Yeah, I mean, I felt like it was fine. It's
they're
just the
just
whole
bickering.
placement was weird.
Oh yeah, it was yeah, I was just like,
It
what?
was
And
strange.
like I thought it was interesting though that because the book describes when Helm is going around killing people, and they say he's the Wraith. In the book, they say he stalked like a snow troll through the camp. And so I thought it was interesting that they think Helm's the supernatural thing, yet that there is also a troll there. Like so they managed to split the difference and have both. So which I thought was interesting. Oh, in terms of Gandalf though, I couldn't help thinking when she gets the letter, I was like they almost could have done this would have been terrible, but if they had done this, like it's almost like Gandalf's almost like Nick Fury at the
I was
end
just
of
thinking that.
like yeah, that's what I was thinking. I'm here to talk to you about the Fellowship Initiative,
Right. So it's the beginning of the new multiverse they're building.
Please no.
This is a criticism that I thought of. I have this for Tolkien's movies as well. It really bugs me that when a threat is coming from Isengard towards Edoras, they go to Helm's Deep, which is in the direction of Isengard, if I'm not mistaken, on my Rohan geography. Whereas what was supposed to happen in both in this and at least in part in the original Two Towers movie or Two Towers book rather, is that they fight at like the fords of Isen or thereabout and lose, right? And then which Theoden didn't, but some of his men did. He was riding out to join them and then retreat to Helm's Deep.
Right.
When you run to Helm's Deep, when the enemy is coming from Isengard or that direction, you're running towards danger. When you really should just go to Dunharrow. But
No, that's true. Yeah.
because it does mention in the appendix that Helm goes out to to the fords of Isen essentially and loses there, while it's also being beset on the eastern front by it doesn't really say who, and
By
then
the
after he loses there
Corsairs,
has to
right?
retreat Helm's Deep. I think the
Right,
Corsairs
yeah.
were attacking Gondor at the time.
Were they?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
I think that's
okay.
why. I think that's why Gondor isn't able to help because
Isn't
they were
able
being
to help
attacked by the
them, yeah.
Corsairs.
Right,
So
that
I don't
sounds
think
right.
it's
Yeah,
clear
yeah,
if
yeah.
they're being attacked by Southanders, Haradrim, Orcs, whoever.
That's why I thought it was neat to have the Haradrim and the Mumakil in the movie, because I was like, okay, I'm like these guys are already attacking Gondor at this same time, and I'm like, so they're kind of in the region. So the fact that Wolf could like hire some to supplement his own forces, I was like, okay. But again, that's another thing where I'm like, I know that because I have this crazy weird encyclopedic knowledge of these books, and it's like, but I don't know how other people are gonna. It'll seem kind of random that the Oliphants are there and all that stuff, but.
Yeah, and also I don't really know if it makes sense having a watcher there, but I mean it's kind of cool seeing a watcher eat an oliphant.
Oh yeah, well I thought I'm like okay, I'm like I always assumed there was more than one of those because I'm
Yeah,
like okay, I'm like it's one of those nameless things that gets like
right.
mentioned, so I'm like okay, but it reminded me of like because it was so big that it had trees growing on it and it could fake as like a little island. It immediately I'm like that thing's just like a Zelda boss.
That's
Like
exactly what I thought of too.
yeah, oh,
I've
I'm like
seen this. I've
I'm like,
seen
this
that.
is like a giant Octorok or something. That
Yep.
giant Octorok boss just sitting there in the lake. Yeah.
That's immediately what I thought of when I have seen this in Breath of the Wild.
That's funny. Um, yeah, I will say that. I mean, this kind of connects that. Generally speaking, I'm okay with most of the echoes to the Jackson movies. In that it's part of the Jackson verse, first of all. So I mean, we can expect that. I would be much more critical if say Rings of Power were so explicit with some of these things, in which I mean obviously you can't escape Jackson at all if you're doing a Tolkien adaptation at this point, so it's going to be there. But as far as the on the nose, I'm more okay with that within the Jackson verse. I kind of like some of the soundtrack nods, the continuity with the Rohirrim theme. I actually kind of appreciated that. It's something kind of special walking into the movie theater and they're playing the Rohan theme, just kind of does bring back that nostalgia, which to an extent I appreciate. Now also, like even in Tolkien, a lot of times we see echoes of events happen across time. And so I'm even okay with some of that. Now I do agree that it's a little bit too explicit at Helm's Deep, where you have the army coming up over the horizon at the last minute. That was a bit too much.
Yeah.
But I'm okay with most of the echoes to a point. But it might just come down to personal taste. I don't know.
My biggest issue was when at the battle in front of Edoras, when all the Rohirrim shout out death. I did not like that at all because it cheapened it for any normal consumer, which I don't know if anybody but extreme Tolkieners went to see this movie anyway based on its sales numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But for a normal person, it's like, oh, that's just what the Rohirrim charge when they ride into battle. No, it's not. Right? I think Jackson adapted it fairly well, right? It's obviously in the movie, not as it takes place in the book, where in the book it's much more a cry of despair and hopelessness from Eomer, right? After he sees his uncle dead and his sister also apparently dead. And he's, he kind of just says death, ride to ruin and the world's ending. I think they adapted that fairly well because you can see how Theoden is riding over the crest of this hill and staring at this force of Mordor and going, we're all going to die. There is no hope. We're all going to die, but we're going to die, dying as men should, as we can, fighting evil, right? And there's something really Tolkien-esque about that because in I think it's the first chapter of the Silmarillion says death is, the gift of men, right? And so this is something that they should not fear, and that men have been made to fear death, and that's in part, how the Númenóreans were corrupted ultimately because they feared death and they sought immortality, which was not theirs to seek. And so, you have that in the Jackson movies really well with Theoden because this is an unwinnable fight. They're riding to their deaths. They'll accept that. It's not the same thing here. This looks like a very winnable battle at Edoras. So it's just this is what the Rohirrim shout. No, it's not. It's so you're kind of cheapening that moment.
Mm. Yeah, and obviously later when Héra says that she's married to death or whatever, they're trying to pull on that same idea.
Right.
And I agree that does kind of cheapen it, and it just seems out of place in the moment. Yeah. I mean, any other thoughts? Anything else that you think is worth bringing up, either for or against?
Oh, I'm sure I have some other thoughts, but not at the moment.
I was just thinking when I was watching the movie, how much of and they could have leaned into this more, of how much a Valkyrie type character Héra sort of is, especially in those, because the Norse can't seem to decide what Valkyrie are. In some stories, they are very much kind of semi-divine or numbered among the Aesir, and in other stories, they are mortal women. So I thought it's okay, I'm I like that there's sort of echoes of the Valkyrie here. But I thought that they could have leaned a little bit more into that. But I was thinking that in the sense of I know there's people who are going to complain that she's here at all, but I'm guys, you need to read the Eddas more.
So what did you think of the name Héra? As just a
that
choice
seems
for
out of
this
place.
character?
I don't know.
I kept wanting. I'm like it should be Freya would be more appropriate, but then there's Freyaloft, so that would get confusing for casual viewers. But I'm
hey, they could handle Sauron and Saruman. I mean
that's true. Although I know people casuals who hate that there's two bad guys that start with S in the movie. But yeah, I'm okay. I get why they gave her a name that starts with H because most of the other members of the royal family do.
Yeah, her brothers, both her brothers and her father.
And her father. Yeah. I'm but it's, and plus, it just makes me think of Héra from Star Wars Rebels.
Oh, it made me think of the Greek goddess.
That
which
too, yeah. But yeah,
Y-
it's like yeah, it just seems like I've seen too many characters recently with that name in things, so I think it's overused, but I was just like, okay. That
Although, I mean,
name choice could be better.
although to be fair, in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, he does introduce it by saying that the Aesir, the Norse gods, were actually originally came from Troy. So that kind of
Oh,
gives
that's
us a
right.
connection to
really.
the Hellenistic
Yeah.
world. So, but I mean, realistically, more to the point, no, it just seems culturally out of place.
They always wanted to connect stuff to Troy because in History of the Kings of Britain, right, by Joffrey of Monmouth, he makes the ancestors of King Arthur come from Troy. They were always trying to work Troy into stuff.
Right. The barbarians always want to claim that they are the true inheritors of the Hellenistic tradition.
Yeah.
Um, cool. Yeah, I mean, anything else? I think we covered a lot of the most important topics, but if there's anything else you guys want to bring up before we close it up,
I don't think so.
fair enough. Well, I enjoyed this conversation. I feel like it was useful, even if we're coming at from slightly different angles. I mean, I think we are at least approaching more or less the same general territory in that, okay, it's better than Rings of Power, maybe not quite as good as Jackson's original movies. Um, you know, at least on a sliding scale, I like this and I want more of it. At least more in this direction. Um,
Right.
that's how I feel kind of coming out of this.
Hey, if
Yeah.
we left Jackson's movies on a high and then went down a big old slope with the Hobbit movies, bottomed out with Rings of Power, and are just starting up the back slope,
Exactly.
that's great. That if that's the direct, if we're going to keep going in that direction, I'm good with this being a stepping stone. Let's put it
Yeah,
that way.
I'm more skeptical of some of the other projects in the Jackson verse coming
I
down
don't
the
know how I feel
pipe.
about Hunt for Gollum.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What do we
I'm
think
very
about
exactly.
that?
Yeah.
skeptical of
Yeah.
Very
that.
skeptical. I mean, I like that Andy Serkis is directing, but I'm very skeptical of that
I
project. Yeah.
don't need any more about Gollum. His story is told and done, and I mean, if it focuses on Aragorn, if you get a good actor to play him, I can't imagine Viggo Mortensen's going to do it.
Well,
Uh,
apparently he's been given a pretty big offer.
yeah, I don't know how that's going to. But anyhow, DH him the entire time. If it focuses on Aragorn, and I'm more than happy to see, a story of Aragorn, especially like, the things he references. How he and the Rangers like kept lands like the Shire safe. There's lots you
Hmm.
can do there. You have a lot of free reign there. But I don't think Gollum is a character that needs more screen time.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Definitely interested to see kind of what plays out there.
Yeah. And I do
Yeah,
want more animated Lord of the Rings stuff. Please. Like, I feel like that's a medium which, you know, it just for fantasy in general is a great medium of animation. And I just think that, there's a lot of room to and a lot of great Tolkien stories that can be adapted by means of animation. And I want more of that, but I just hope that, they don't take the at least initial, underperforming of this movie to be like, oh, we should never do anything like this again. I'm like, ugh. But yeah.
yeah, I do worry a little bit about that the fact that it doesn't seem to be performing very well. If that's going to
Anime
cause them
is a
to
tough
cut the bait,
sell
and
in
yeah.
America. It is, yeah. But
Now, Andrew, you said you haven't really watched much anime or animated shows at all.
Yeah, I
Um,
just
as an adult.
not something I tend to be. I mean, I don't watch a lot of anything anymore, really, just for time's sake. But
fine.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've just never been super drawn to animation, at least not as an adult.
Well, let me make one recommendation. This is a show I will recommend to literally everybody. It's Avatar: The Last Airbender. Um, Now this the original animated show. There was a live action remake, the first season anyway, that came out on Netflix. It's not very good. There was also a movie that came out in 2010 just called The Last Airbender, which is horrible. But the original animated show is one of the most edifying and inspiring stories I've watched ever.
Yeah.
Um,
It's I totally agree with that. It's in like my top, fictional universes or fictional stories ever, it ranks extremely high. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say, if nothing else, this movie has opened me up to that avenue, and so I'm definitely more open to that than I probably was before. So maybe that's a win, if nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, cool. Well, I guess we can go ahead and wrap it there. I appreciate this conversation. Thanks again, Thomas and Sam, for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was an absolute blast.
Yeah, thank you as always, Andrew. This has been terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so thank you for listening to this conversation. I hope that you found this as useful as I did. And I would love to hear your thoughts. If you've seen the movie, and I think that you should give it a fair shake. Go in with an open mind, see what you think. And I would love to hear your thoughts. You can send me a message or give me a comment somewhere relevant on X over at Andrew N. Snyder. You can email me at mythicmindpodcast@gmail.com. And, I would love to share some of your thoughts on the show and interact with them a little bit. And so let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this conversation and you want me to be able to do more things like this on a regular basis, then I would truly appreciate your support. Now, of course, the greatest support comes in terms of finances, because that literally buys me the time to do things like this. And so if you would like to support me financially and become part of the insider community in the Mythic Mind Fellowship, which includes Discord access, exclusive content, ad-free content, ad-free episodes, early episodes, if all that kind of stuff appeals to you and you want to help me to keep moving on this road that goes ever on, then you can go over to patreon.com/mythicmind. Any level of support helps, but I will say that if you sign on at the tier 3 or higher, that's $25 a month or higher, then that will give you live access to the 12-week Lord of the Rings course that begins in early January, which is not that far away from now. And so we'll be reading through the entire Lord of the Rings together. There will be a couple videos every week that goes into some aspect of context or the philosophy of Tolkien, or that will serve as a reading companion for that week's reading. And then we'll also have Discord conversation. We'll have live meetings. And obviously not everyone's going to be able to do everything, but if any or all of that interests you, then you can sign on to patreon.com/mythicmind at $25 a month or higher. And of course, lesser levels of support definitely help as well. Now, if you can't or don't necessarily want to support me financially at this time, you can always share this around, make sure you subscribe, all the normal things to increase range, increase in audience. That would definitely be greatly appreciated. But I do want to go ahead and thank by name all of my tier 2 patrons and higher. And so that's Mark, Aaron D, Evie, Paul, Aaron S, Andrew G, Andrew M, Arturo, Brandon, Emmy, Ian, Jeremiah, Jocelyn, Josh, Joshua, Landon, Paul, Sarah, and Steele. Thank you so much for your support, which helps me to keep doing things like this. And of course, thank you to all of my tier 1 patrons as well. You definitely don't go unnoticed. Now, before we go, I do have one book recommendation for you, although I actually don't have a physical copy around me at the time. But that is Tolkien and the Great War, The Threshold of Middle-earth. This book by John Garth is it's one of my favorite biographical looks at Tolkien, specifically looking at this segment of his life. No, I really enjoy the Carpenter biography, which takes more of a broad scale, more holistic view. I think there's a lot of very significant and just interesting and fun insights that come from the Carpenter book. But this book, which takes a segmented view, really focusing in on his time in and around World War I, I think provides just a deeper level of appreciation, or not appreciation, but deeper level of insight in this very formative time of Tolkien's life, and the way that translated into the beginnings of his legendarium. Just fascinating, engaging, interesting. You can pick up the book or you can listen to the audiobook. And again, that was Tolkien and the Great War. All right, well, that's it for now. I appreciate you joining me, and I look forward to what lies on the road ahead. But until next time, Godspeed.